Everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all. As you know, we're here today for Champ Camp. We're joined today by our guest, Shrestha Ramji. And before we hop straight into the questions, Shrestha, if you'd like to introduce yourself, now would be a great time to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate it. My name is Shrestha Ramji once again. And last year I competed in DECA for two events. Principles of Marketing was my main one. I did that at the state level, district level, and ICDC. And then my other event was Startup Business Plan or ESB. And I go to Lynbrook High School currently, and I'm a sophomore.
Right, very cool. So, what initially sparked your interest in the Principles of Marketing event?
Yeah, for sure. So for principles of marketing, I already knew I had to do principles given that I was a first year member last year, given that it was my freshman year. And so when I was trying to decide which one I really wanted to focus in on, I was thinking more about my personal skill set and what I knew I could definitely work on and also succeed in. And so for me, I always knew I had more of a creative side, and I felt like that would be geared more towards principles of marketing as opposed to any of the other ones, like finance, for example. And I also really liked that it was a very specialized area of like business overall, because there was always the option for me to go for business management and administration, and that was definitely one that I was thinking about pretty hard before I made the final decision. But I felt like marketing was something that really again spoke to my own skill sets and was something that would allow me to demonstrate what I already knew about marketing from the past.
And keeping on that track, after competing within the principles of marketing events for this past year, what would you say you have enjoyed the most about the events, whether it's, preparation for it, the competition?
Yeah, so I think the last part of what you were saying cut out a little bit for me, but I think I get overall what you were saying. I think for me, there was a lot of things that I did enjoy about the event. And I think the best part about it would be just when you were actually in the room talking to a judge. And although that is the most nerve-wracking time, I think it is for a lot of people, it's also the time when you actually get to put to test everything that you've been doing for the past 4 or 5 months on end, just prepping for the event. And I also really like my judge at States particularly. She made it really exciting to talk to her because she treated the entire role play like a conversation as opposed to me just talking to her one way. And what was really special about that was every time I said something, she would smile or she would nod or she'd give me some sort of verbal acknowledgement. And that was something that really supported me as a first year member because knowing that again, I was talking, pretending like I was a business executive of some sort, a marketing manager or something like that. I feel like talking to them was the one time when I actually got to feel it and embody the role that I was playing. So yeah, I would say that was my favorite part.
Great to hear it. And how do you think participating in Principles of Marketing has prepared you for the future? And where do you think you want to take this year?
Yeah, so I think in terms of where I'm taking it this year, I am continuing on that marketing pathway. I'm doing another marketing event this year, business services marketing. And I think that Principles of Marketing was a great starting point. And given that I was trying it out for my first year in DECA, I think it was a great chance for me to familiarize myself with the content that would be there in another marketing exam or another marketing role play. So, for example, I was already taking a business course in my school. It was part of the requirement to be able to compete in DECA. And through that course, I was learning a lot about marketing alongside everything else. And taking those skills, I first applied that to the role play that I was doing. And taking that further, now I can remember all of that, look back at my old notes, and apply it this year as well when I'm prepping for my role play. And then beyond this, I think career-wise, principles of marketing, not just as that specific event, but principles as a whole is a really great way for you to dabble in various areas of business because I tried out a role play with principles of business administration first. Then I tried out marketing, and then I think I tried one out as well for hospitality before I finalized my decision. And in doing so, I got to explore all these areas which I might potentially specialize in one day, which was a really great opportunity.
Okay, so I guess now more in line with the actual principles events, how would you say that you built the knowledge and skills necessary to succeed in principles of marketing?
Sure. So it definitely took a lot of preparation, but I also think a lot of it was from doing it time and time again. So within Lynbrook DECA, I had a lot of great mentors. This was not just the officers, but a lot of upperclassmen that were there for me. AJ was actually one of them because he was our director of principals last year, and he gave us a lot of really great advice that I was able to apply within my event, but also stuff that I'm going to be carrying with me this year as well. And then there was also a lot of people, again, upperclassmen that I turned to. I did practice role plays with them, and it really helped me out because I was really, again, nervous at first when I was going into this event because it was my first year. But by doing these practice role plays, you get a feel for generally how you want to start off your role play, how you're going to end it off, and kind of building some sort of format that you want to follow for every single role play. So that way you're not thinking about it completely on the spot. And another thing that helped me with building my knowledge was studying for the exam. So as many of you may know, if you are a first-year competitor, DECA does provide you with a complete blueprint of everything you're going to need to know when you're studying for your exam. And when you're studying for that, you can look at the list of performance indicators that are available on their website. And when you look at that, what's really helpful is they have things that encompass not just marketing, but various other concepts within the business field. And so when you're preparing for all of those at a very high level, you're able to get information that's applicable to your role play as well. And so overall, I think all of those really helped me out.
That's very good. Those are great resources that you shared. And so you've competed locally and on the ICDC stage. So how do you think competition at those different levels differ? How are they similar? And how did you prepare for those environments?
Yeah, so I think it's actually funny, but I find that regional competition was more nerve-wracking than ICDC. And I think the main reason for this is typically when you are competing at SBCDC as a freshman, it's your first conference. And that's an experience that is something that you've never felt before. And especially since I hadn't done anything like DECA in the past, it was something that I did have to prep a lot for. I think after doing all those practice role plays, SBCDC was something that came a bit as like more practice in a way. Then once I got to States, I knew that this was a time when it mattered for qualification. And so I definitely prepped a lot more. And then when it came to ICDC, finally, I think that that was my point where I knew that everything that I had prepared for had culminated to this moment. And so although I did prepare and continued, taking practice exams, I didn't overdo it in a way that I felt like I was over prepping. I kind of try to keep it a little bit more low scale because I knew that again, if I did over prep, I might kind of freak myself out when I actually did go into that role play room. And I think when I actually did my final role play, what helped me was not looking at that entire study guide I had made, not looking at all the performance indicators, but by just staying calm and going into that room and knowing that whatever happened, it was my best effort that I was going to give. And that's probably advice I would give to any other competitors, no matter whether you're going to be competing at the ICDC level or if you're just competing at your regional conference. Just give it your best effort because at this point, after how much ever studying you might have done, that's all you can really do. So that's what matters most.
So I'm gonna kind of piggy off what you're just talking about, that kind of nervousness at maybe your first regional conference. Seeing as you competed in principles, which is a first year event, what would you kind of say, like, if you had to kind of give like maybe three pieces of solid advice, what would those be as like obviously regional competition is happening either this week or next week for everyone in California DECA. So what
Mhm.
would be like three pieces of advice that at this point someone could do to help themselves feel more comfortable going into that role play?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's definitely a lot of things I could go over, but I would try to skip over that generic advice so that you guys get something that's more meaningful to you. I think the main thing that worked for me was the first impression that you give in your role play is what matters probably the most. And even before your role play starts, even before the person sets off that timer and says, it's time for you to go in and handshake your judge, I think you need to already be looking at them, making eye contact if you can, and already smiling because I think to them, they've already seen maybe what is it, 5, 7 role plays by this point, depending on whether you're an earlier or a later slot. And so you want to make sure that they know that you're excited to be here, that you're not just doing this because, you have to get it over with, and that you're also looking forward to talking to them because if they're a parent, for example, which might be the case at your district conference, they want to have something that's going to make them excited to listen to you and something that's going to make them think, oh, this person is kind of going to know what they're talking about. And I think that all starts with that first impression and also maybe the first 10 seconds of your role play, the way you start introducing yourself, the way you kind of use gestures, use inflection in your voice, things like that to make yourself really stand out to them. Okay, and then for 2 other tips, I would say when you're actually going over your PIs, what's helpful is to not just talk about them by definition, because that's something that a lot of competitors will do. Because if you think about it, they've all studied these PIs most likely, and they know all the content. But at the end of the day, your role play is when you're given a prompt or a scenario, and you want to make sure that everything you're saying ties back to that scenario. That was actually feedback that I got from my state's judge, and I think that you guys should all try to apply that early on, because when you're talking, it's really easy to get lost in just the PIs themselves. But remember to talk about why that's significant to whatever you're being asked to do. So, for example, if you're being asked to write a marketing plan, and it's for a company that's struggling because they haven't been getting enough customers in the new, I guess, urban setting that they might be in, you want to definitely talk about why your marketing plan that you're suggesting would be relevant to that. And don't just talk about what a marketing plan is or what a promotional function is or something like that. And then I think the last thing I would tell you is to not, I guess, overstress yourself out before with studying every single performance indicator, but prioritize your studying more effectively. So if you're going for the district conference, some of you guys might know this already, but you're given an instructional area that is already preset for you. And so based on that instructional area, you can kind of strategize your prepping a little bit more and know exactly what you need to know for your role play. And I think this is helpful because if you try to study all 400 or 500 indicators at once, it's likely that not a lot of it is going to stick. And if you're at this point in the year already where you want to try doing that, I would just recommend studying those main performance indicators that you've been assigned. And that's probably a better way to go about prepping.
All right, that's some great, very specific advice. So let's take this down how you personally studied. What did your study or like preparation timeline look like? Did you do any cramming before? And how do you think you dealt with like nerves for competition, especially?
Yeah, so I think for me, prepping was mostly done for the exam. It was funny because going into my state's role play, a lot of people were asking me, oh, you must have practiced a ton, right, to be able to get that first place win. But it was funny because I had only studied for my exam because I was thinking that that was what was going to matter in terms of conceptual understanding. And that for the role play, I would go into it, I would try my best to just talk on the spot and we'll see what goes from there. But I think for all that prep that I did for districts, it carried on over to state. So I didn't have to be directly doing any prep for my role play then. But what I did ask was I asked one of my neighbors across from me in when we were rooming, and I asked her, what is one tip you would give me to have an excellent role play? And what she told me was you have to always make sure you're making it interactive. So that was something I all of a sudden didn't really think about. So I was really focusing in on that. And so instead of cramming for the content, what I started to do was think about potential questions I could ask my judge and ways I could kind of make it more like a conversation as opposed to me just talking at the person. And I think this helps a lot because they tend to doze off if you're talking for maybe 5 or 6 minutes on end without ever stopping or taking pauses. So having an interactive thing like that can definitely help you out.
So again, I'm gonna rubber band off of what you said. You talked about making it interactive for your judge. Hopefully you still remember this, but when you're competing at ICDC, whether you want to choose your preliminary or final round competition, could you tell us some of the ways that you did actually make it interactive for your judge? And if you have any differing strategies for when there's one as opposed to two judges, because that is something that happens sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. So at ICDC, I did actually have two judges for one of my role plays. So I think that when it comes to a situation like that, you want to make sure that they both kind of get equal attention. So in terms of interactive elements, it sometimes just starts off with something as simple as asking them, how are you doing? Is your day going well? Because those are all really simple conversational tricks that people would do in a real setting as well. And then besides that, what I also included was I think I asked my judge at States, it was something related to information management, I remember. And I was asking her, have you ever used any of this concept overall? And I asked her, like, what are a couple of examples that you've used it in your daily life? And in a way, this is a way for you to stall for your own time because you have a 10-minute role play window when you're going to be talking. But if you don't have all of it figured out yet, that's okay. And it's a really good way to optimize your time because you're asking your judge something so they get a chance to talk to you a little bit as well. But at the same time, you're also giving them some, or they're giving you something that you can build off of further in your role play. And that usually helps a lot if you aren't completely sure what you want to talk about yet. And then I think the other way you can make it interactive is if you see them kind of not fully understanding anything, or if it looks like they're lost in any way, stopping them for a moment and asking them, is everything I said so far clear to you? Or is there anything I should reiterate or go over again? And usually that helps a lot.
All right, cool. So now we want to talk over a little bit sort of the minutes of prep that you have before the role play. So how do you use that time and what do you do specifically? Like give us a walkthrough of what you're thinking, what you're creating, like sort of like some extra designs, drawings, any supplementals you're doing.
Yeah, sure. So during that 10-minute prep time, it's not a lot of time, I'm going to be honest. And so it's usually better to not do everything in that 10 minutes of prep. And what I mean by that is, again, knowing what you might want to start off with and how you might want to conclude. Those are things that are going to matter the most because you're starting and you're ending. Just like in a book, you would really want to start off strong and then end off strong as well. So sometimes what helps is to know if you know what your role play is going to be about, which in the case of districts, you do because you're given that instructional area. Try to study it a bit and know what that might entail, and also know about typical scenarios that you might see. And why this helps is because you might actually see one of those scenarios land up on your roleplay prep sheet, and that takes away a lot of that time you would have spent just trying to understand what it means in the first place. Usually for me though, during those 10 minutes, I spend more time on making my visuals as opposed to just reading the prompt. And why I do this is because everyone can read a prompt and just know information, but I think what really sets you apart is how you interpret it and take it to the next level. And so what I did with mine is I usually try to stick to like graphs, tables, and stuff like that, but also have a couple of things that are more creative, like having cartoons or having something that's more on the graphic-y side, if that makes sense. So I remember at districts, I believe, I had something which was like a digital showroom, and I literally drew out the map of the store because I wanted to show my judge that it was an idea that is possible to be carried out. And I think that this also demonstrates a deep understanding of your own ideas that you were proposing because it shows that you weren't, I guess, copying from previous ones and that you were thinking completely on the spot.
Okay, so now kind of shifting gears a little bit, can you describe a time that you kind of faced a major challenge while you were competing or yeah, a major challenge and how you kind of addressed it or overcame it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll try to think of one. I think in terms of what I faced as a challenge, it might not be so much as during the competition, but it was actually in the moments before I got in. So this was actually for my written plan, but it was a pretty competitive and like there was a lot of people competing in my event. And as a result, when I actually went in for my time slot, there was about a 1.5 hour delay. But I was not aware of this. And when I went into that like room to talk to the receptionist and ask her if there was any available seating or if I was supposed to go in, I was a bit lost because there was no one else that I knew from our school directly that would be doing that event. And so I sat there for a good 30 minutes, not sure what to do because no one told me there was a delay directly. And I think I could have definitely repurposed that time better, maybe prepping for the presentation itself. But it was actually kind of funny that now that I look back at it because everyone was facing that same delay. There was like at least 10 or 20 people from different schools that were all just sitting there clueless. And we could have easily asked each other as well about what was going on or if there was any reason why things weren't happening. But I think it's also just a good lesson for all of you to know that even though they have a set schedule, usually it doesn't need to go exactly as per that plan. And it's important for you to use your time wisely. So come early for your event, but also make sure that if you are there early and it is ending up getting delayed, to make sure that that time in between, you're able to optimize that. And so I was trying thinking of like any other challenges I faced during the competition itself. I think it might be for that same event, ESB. I reached the end of my presentation and my judge asked me a question about something that I had gone over, I think close to the beginning of it. And again, as a first year member, I wasn't sure if I should reiterate old information or if I should have like waived that question and gone on to another one. So of course I did answer it in the end, but I think that was a good learning opportunity for me to know that if they do ask you something that you already repeated before, to definitely go over it again because those are possible places you could lose points on your rubric, and it's important to make sure they're clear on every part of your presentation.
All right, very nice. Glad to see that you learned from those experiences. And we want to sort of talk about the thing that you just pointed out, like judges asking questions at the end. What would you recommend someone do if the judge asks a question or a sort of marketing like aspect of your marketing plan that you haven't really touched on, that you don't really know the nuances of? What do you do in that situation where they ask more than what you've explained?
Absolutely, that's a really great point to bring up. So I think if there was a situation where you got something that was asked to you completely on the spot, I think that's actually probably the best way for you to show your judge that you know how to do things impromptu. Because in the end, that's the spirit of the role play, that you're not having things in advance, or you have it in like you have it for 10 minutes, but you don't have much more time to prep for it. And so for those types of questions, what I usually like to do is just re-summarize the key points I went over. Usually that's written down on a piece of paper. And if you're also prepping the way I do, which is where I like to write down all the performance indicators, and then below each one, I write down in bullet points some of the things I want to say. I usually try to reiterate those and also weave it into the question because, again, because the questions are on the spot, you don't always know an answer that's really effective. And I think the other thing I would say is most questions aren't going to have a definite yes or no answer. And the reason why they give you these questions in the first place is because they want to see how you can evaluate your options and kind of see the pros and cons of everything. And so if they ask you something that seems like it might have a clear pathway, don't go straight to that and be like, yes or absolutely not, because usually they don't like that and they want to see that you're thinking things through. Or if it does have a definite answer, if it's one of those things that you can't see any way around, try to show yourself working through that process of why you chose that answer, and don't answer it in 10 seconds or less. Try to keep it to at least 30 seconds per question.
Okay. So kind of, I guess, thinking back to your time competing within principles of marketing, uh, from the event specifically, and I guess maybe from your first year, what would you say has been, one of the things that you wish you could have done differently or maybe adapted now that you have however much more experience you have now?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's probably a lot of things I could say about that one, but maybe one thing I would say is when I'm prepping for the actual role play, actually, contrary to the advice I was giving earlier, but I would say do more practice role plays and don't just try to study for the exam. Both are definitely very important, but I think in my case, what I did was I actually wrote down every single one of the performance indicators that was given to us. And over like a 1 month period, I tried to study them all, thinking that, I'd be prepared if anything did show up. But realistically speaking, trying to memorize that much information at one go, especially before a conference like this, isn't usually the most optimal way to study once again, because cramming information isn't the best way to actually remember things, because usually DECA exams, since they're not your typical exams, are going to cover information that's more on the spot. And actually last year, what took me by surprise was there was a lot of questions on emotional intelligence, and this still holds true this year as well. I can double check with the principal's blueprint, but I think that's how it is. And why I say that is because if you think about it, no one's going to tell you when you're in kindergarten or first grade how you're supposed to respond to people when they get mad at you, right? Those are things that you have to build up over time. And so a lot of DECA's questions are like that. They're going to ask you based on a situation, how would you best react and why would you choose this? And they're not going to be your conventional responses, and that's okay. But I think that when I was studying, I try to focus on those conventional responses, which is why it may not have worked out as like well as it could have on my exam. And I think in terms of the role play, the same thing applies, because they're not gonna be asking you things that they want you to already have known in advance. Usually the whole point of it is to think on your feet and apply all those skills that you've been learning before. So what you want to do is not try to mug up information, but definitely think based on the experiences you've gained over life, and try to apply that in a way that would sound more relatable, because your judge is also a human being at the end of the day, and they've gone through a lot of similar things that you've been going through like your entire life. And if you bring up a couple of those as examples during your role play, I think that it's a great way for them to resonate with some parts of your role play as well.
Okay, great. We'll just wrap up with this last question before we open it up to audience participation. So, what do you think is the most common mistake competitors make, and how do you think they can avoid it? Just maybe one major thing and one major way they can fix it.
Sure. So I'm going to say this because I know I did it myself, and I know a lot of you here are probably doing it right now, but don't put things for the last minute. And why I say this is because we're all guilty of it at some point. We don't feel like studying because we don't know how to do things, or we feel like taking on such a big challenge like studying for a whole exam, or trying a whole entire practice role play. I think the best way to tackle it is to just go and do it. And it's easier said than done, but I think that by spacing out the way you study over a month or two, which is what you're given usually, It's much better than you trying to do it all in the week before SVCDC or SCDC. But at this point, most of you guys are at that point where you have 2 days before the actual conference. And so if that's not what's going to work for you right now, then take every last minute that you have to give it your all. Because at the end of the day, if you do any cramming and it does end up helping you, you'll really wish that you did that one extra exam that you had access to, or you will really wish that you asked that one other question you had to maybe an officer at your local chapter, or you might wish that you kind of ran things over with someone else or got a second opinion. And I also think that on that same note, one way to go about this is by not being scared to ask for help if you need it. Asking, again, your officers, asking upperclassmen or even underclassmen, friends that you have in school, asking even your parents, because usually they also enjoy listening to what you have to say and they like to see your role plays and your written ideas.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Shrestha. So now we're gonna hop into like audience questions. The first one I have is from Krish. She's asking, how many minutes do you recommend speaking for in role plays?
Yeah, so usually for role plays, I think what's optimal is to speak for around 7 minutes if you're doing principles, and then leave 3-ish minutes for questions. This can also vary based on what your prompt is, because some prompts are longer than others and have more nuances. But if you are answering a typical principles prompt, 7 minutes should be good for talking.
Okay,
Thank you.
I have one more. They're asking, this isn't, I guess, kind of competition specific, but more, do you have any tips for dealing with nerves? Like, you mentioned feeling nervous at the start. How might people be able to get over that?
Yeah, that's a question that I think that you learn a lot by experiencing too. But I would say that the best way I did it was by finding peers and friends that would keep me going throughout the entire conference. And usually, if you don't have someone that you know, I actually met two of my closest friends in DECA right before I was about to go into my role play. They were both doing PMK with me. And I think we could all tell that we were nervous, like we were mutually feeling that. But we tried to connect with each other about it and we introduced ourselves. And actually, one of them started talking about how much she loved Hamilton, and it was not really related to the role play itself, but it was a great way to divert my mind from what I was thinking about, which was obviously, how am I going to answer all these questions? How is the role play going to go? And things like that. I think that finding these people are going to be really important because even if you don't know them, or even if they're from a totally different chapter, meet them whether it's before your role play or after, and try to form bonds with them because usually they're the people that are going to help you release those nerves towards the time when you're competing. And if that doesn't work for you, if you're more of the person who likes to stick to people you already know, then talk to your friends within your chapter. And usually your roommates are a great source to look toward.
All right, cool. We have one more. So,
Mhm.
what types of graphs or tables do you think is most effective in supporting your role play or being like sort of like an above and beyond thing that you do? And how do you overall use that to leave a strong impression on the judge?
Yeah, sure. For me, I would say that when you're making any sort of table or graph, avoid using too much text and try to show more by your drawings. And I know that not everyone is the more artistic kind of person, but even if you aren't, it's totally fine because you can work with geometric shapes and that's also equally as good. And what I mean by this is by drawing simple things, like if you're talking about ideas, draw a light bulb. If you're talking about something that really matters to someone's interests, draw a heart. And these are all really small things, but they add a lot to the visual importance of the things that you're saying. And I would also say for tables, it's not exactly a table, but usually a rule of thumb is to go with the flow chart. Flow charts are great ways to show your ideas and how you're going to link them together. And I think it also helps your judge because they can follow what you're saying. And why I say this is because a lot of times you're saying so much at once that they think that I guess it's really easy to get lost in what you're saying. And also, it's not always easy to remember exactly what PIs you're covering. So that's another thing I would recommend is just writing down all your performance indicators, keeping it as something that both you and your judge can see. And then that way, neither of you get lost at any point during the role play. And I think there was one other one that I was thinking of. It was making graphs that aren't just graphs for the sake of being a graph, but graphs that show real life data. And why I put that in quotations because you don't have access to Google when you're doing your role play. But if you want to make up statistics on the spot, that's okay as long as they are within reason. And so if you want to come up with something that would support one of your claims, just make up a number that doesn't sound too way off there, and I think it would work out pretty well.
And there's a question from Marush in the chat. He's asking, what would set you apart in a role play, and how do you limit ums and filter words?
For limiting the filler words, actually, I learned a really good technique last year, which was every time you think you're going to say one, close your mouth and take a pause. And it sounds, again, a lot easier said than done, but if you practice a lot of role plays by doing that, it usually sticks over time. And usually what helps is if you think you're going to take, if like what I just did, if I say at any point, what usually helps is to slow your speaking, because when you're talking really fast, it tends to get hard for you to keep going because your brain is only working as fast as you are speaking. And I think that would help a lot. And then in terms of setting yourself apart, a lot of the tips I went over already should help with that. But I would also say, again, make sure to look very pleasant and polite when you're talking to your judge and have that affability about you. So having that smile again, maintaining that throughout your role play and ending it off very nicely as well, just as you would have started.
Amazing advice. We have one other one. If you don't know what one of the PIs mean, is there anything important you should do, and how do you sort of like cover that up almost?
That happens a lot actually. So it's a good thing that you brought up. But I think if you don't know a PI, it can be okay to make up information as long as you're not saying something that's, again, totally way off there. And if you don't completely know something that the judge is asking, it's okay to ask them to repeat the question or to clarify it a little bit more, just as long as you're not asking them to do that time and time again. And oftentimes what happens is if you do get asked something with a lot of jargon in the question itself or the PI itself, then you might want to break that down a little bit more using things that you already know. And if you don't necessarily know that specific word, you can try to tie it to things that are related to that. And if the judge is not able to catch that, then that works just as well.
Okay, I think that is all the questions that we have for right now. Thank you everyone so much for joining, and we appreciate your time today.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much.
All right, thank you.